Good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Mark Lapore. You can call me Mark or Dr. Mark, whatever you're comfortable with. And if, as Christina said a little earlier, if you do have questions tonight, feel free to ask questions, especially if you want a clarifying question. And if you want to wait till the end, we're going to have some time at the end of the presentation to have some discussion. And I always welcome that in my presentations. And I like to get feedback and to hear where people are coming from. And tonight's presentation is on coping with stress and anxiety. And this is, I think, an important topic, and it's one that I'm very interested in, as I am a professional therapist and counselor and have been so for many years. And I know that many people experience issues with anxiety from time to time and with feeling stressed out and overwhelmed from time to time, especially in situations like the one we're dealing with now, the COVID-19 pandemic situation, and especially as it wears on. It's going to present different challenges for people. So I enjoy trying to help people work through those challenges. Another thing I do, I work a lot with crisis intervention and helping individuals and organizations bounce back from trauma and crisis when it happens. And I'm also an educator, so I'm a full-time professor. So I teach people also how to help others in situations like this. So anyway, I want to bring some of my knowledge to bear on this situation tonight about coping with stress and anxiety. And I'm glad that you all could be with us this evening. And I start out, I'm a big fan of quotes. And this is a very simple quote by Amit Ray. And it just says, in every crisis, the true heroism is self-discipline, patience, and strong determination. So those just seem like some basic characteristics. But in trying times like we have now, that becomes true heroism. So that's something to think about moving forward. How can we develop more self-discipline, patience, and determination? So, you know, the National Institute of Mental Health is a branch of the government that does a lot of research into how people cope in different situations. And they know that the fear and anxiety that people are having about COVID-19 can bring about a lot of strong emotions in adults and children. And, you know, I don't have to tell you guys that because you're probably experiencing it, or you know that your children are, or you know somebody who is. So being able to develop coping mechanisms in response to that stress can actually make us stronger, even though it's not easy, you know, because you hear that a lot. It's going to make you stronger. Well, it can make you stronger, but it's a journey, right? So I'm going to talk about some different things that we can use on that journey. So in response to that, like, think about this for yourself. What are some stress reactions you've noticed in yourself or others during this time of the pandemic? What have been some of your reactions? Maybe some have been predictable, and maybe some that you didn't really count on happening, but you see them happening with you and other people you care about. So those reactions are going to vary by individual or by family, but here are some potential stress reactions that many people are experiencing. And that is fear and maybe excessive worry about one's own health and the health of loved ones. And I know, you know, unexpectedly, I had a lot of worry because my son, who was married a year and a half ago, his wife is pregnant now. And so I know that, you know, it's a difficult time for them, and they have, you know, worries about a healthy pregnancy as well as trying to stay safe in this pandemic. And I think about that a lot, and I was really surprised at how much that kind of drew me into worrying about that situation. I still am worrying about it, but it surprised me that I'm worrying about it as much as I have been. What happens for a lot of people are changes in sleep or eating patterns. And a lot of people have been talking to me about that in my private practice or otherwise in groups that I work with, that, you know, sleep has been disrupted, or, you know, patterns of sleep have been disrupted. Maybe you're going to sleep earlier or you're going to sleep later. So those types of things, and that's very, very common for people. Many people are having some difficulty concentrating, staying focused, and that's pretty a common reaction as well. Worsening fear of chronic health problems, that's on a lot of people's minds. And then, like with any stressful situation, people sometimes will choose maladaptive coping mechanisms. So they become maladaptive when you overuse them. Like, use of alcohol. Some people don't touch alcohol at all. Some people maybe say they have a glass of wine at night. But now with the current situation, people are saying, well, now I'm having 2 or 3 glasses of wine. And that can be counterproductive in so many other ways. So those are things to think about, because we will tend to go to maladaptive coping mechanisms in difficult times like that. So here, just a sample of things that you might look for in children and teens. Younger children might be more irritable than before, maybe crying more. There could be returning to behaviors that they've outgrown, toileting accidents, other types of clinging behavior. They could be exhibiting more worry than you've seen them exhibit. Maybe they seem a little more sad. A lot of times in teens, because teens don't like to admit vulnerability, being a teenager is about being strong, developing your own identity. And instead of showing sadness, a lot of times they'll act out a little bit. So that's another thing to look for, that's a potential with teenagers. Schoolwork avoidance, of course, you probably, if you have young ones in school, you know what a challenge that whole thing has been. And maybe many of us have just grown a greater appreciation for teachers and how difficult that job is. So I've known that for a long time. I was a school counselor for 10 years. So I really do have an appreciation for how difficult a job that educators have. But now a lot of those responsibilities were put on parents and on families. And that brought with it a lot of different challenges and strains that people hadn't thought about before. There could be avoidance of activities. I mean, they're telling us that we need to avoid activities. And people can get kind of caught in a cycle and start avoiding activities that they may have enjoyed in the past, just staying away from them, even if they're not counterindicated by what's going on now. And then, of course, a lot of times stress will manifest itself in the body with aches and pains. So we might be having like neck aches or back aches or other headaches. You've heard of stress headaches, you've probably experienced that. But that's not uncommon at all, that stress will manifest itself physically that way. When thinking about stress, I know you hear a lot about stress now. I'm going to try to just talk about it in ways that we don't often talk about it, or maybe you could think about it in maybe a way you haven't thought about it before. But our bodies have ways of responding to stress that protect us, right? And it's almost a natural defense system that we have. The thing about it is, if we have too little stress in our lives, we actually tend to lack motivation. We tend to not get motivated to do too much if we have too little stress. They actually did a lot of studies about this, and they know that we actually are at our peak activity when we have a certain amount of stress. But it's almost like if you picture it on a bell curve, the middle of that bell curve is like, that's how much stress you have about an activity. And if you're in the middle, then you have that stress that motivates you to do well. If you go past the middle of that bell curve and you have too much stress, then it actually takes away from our ability to do well. So it really comes down to being able to have some control over that stress, which we do. We don't often think we have that control, but we do have some control. And then controlling it where we're still able to function in an optimal way. So we know that stress can impact sleep. That was mentioned before. And especially true as we're responding to this pandemic situation. And it's really at times like these that it's vital that we recognize and manage our stress. Because the other thing about it is prolonged stress will affect our immune systems. So if we continue to have ongoing stress that's not controlled, it can impact us in terms of our physical health as well. So ideally, if we're faced with a stressful situation in our lives, we kind of get keyed up, we feel that stress, we manage the situation, and our bodies return to a more normal, calmer state. However, when you're faced with a global pandemic, there's still no end to it, foreseeable end, even though I guess it seems like it's getting better for a lot of people. What comes next, though? You know, now that we're going to green in a couple of days, at least in the Pittsburgh area where I'm from, we're going green, which means that we can go back outside. With that, though, brings other concerns, and you go to maybe somewhere that you've been 100 times, like a restaurant, but now there's certain protocol that you have to follow. Or you go to a grocery store, and there's a certain pattern that you have to follow in the store. There's just a lot of things that are new for us, and that can heighten our stress level. But it's just accepting that there is going to be stress. It's new for us, and then taking direct steps to make sure that we take care of ourselves. Saying that we're going to, understanding that we're going to be under a little more stress, and that we should do something about it. And it's okay to do something about it, because I think a lot of times people feel like if they're under stress, I have to keep working harder. I have to keep pushing harder. I can't take time out now to relax. And that's actually the very time you should be taking time to relax and think about yourself. So I guess that's something to focus on, that even though you think you should be pushing harder, make sure that you take that time to relax and do something that de-stresses yourself, because that's as important as anything else that you might do. The other interesting thing about stress or worry is that our brains are programmed to repetitively think about the negative. Think about that in your own lives. Like I know, that I teach at the university now, and actually I've been a student a lot myself. You get a paper back, and maybe you even get an A on the paper, but you lost 5 points for something that you didn't do right. You keep focusing on those 5 points that you lost for some reason. And that is a common pattern. And just like our lives in general, we start to have this natural, here's how they put it, a natural negativity bias. And that bad stuff tends to stick to us. And one of the reasons why it sticks to us is our brains want to remember what went wrong so we can avoid this situation in the future. So it's actually an adaptive characteristic that we keep worrying about what went wrong. However, if it becomes habitual and we can't turn it off, then it becomes a pattern that tends to be negative in nature and not helpful at a certain point. So we have this fight or flight that you often heard about, or it can be referred to as our emergency system. And this emergency system, this fight or flight that readies us to be safe, it can be triggered by a real threat in our environment. Like now, when we're hearing all these reports of dangers out there, and what we hear and see in the news media on a daily basis. And I know, like, I don't know where you stand with this. Like, some people are watching news all the time, and I really enjoy news. Like, I like seeing news and reading about news, but as lately anymore, I've had to turn it off. I just have to change the channel for a while, or read something lighthearted for a while, because too much negative information circulating around can just trigger our emergency systems too much, and it doesn't allow for a refurbishing of our system or a period of downtime. Okay, so let's see. Repeatedly triggered emergency system events can cause health problems, like I mentioned earlier, because they actually trigger hormones in our bodies that can cause health problems. What they're saying is that viewing stress as normal and helpful can also buffer the negative health impact. That being said, that's easier said than done, but by saying that we are going to have stress in our lives, it is going to be challenging, and accepting that, it can actually help buffer the negative impact. Because a lot of people, and I hear them say this, we shouldn't have to be dealing with this. I shouldn't have to care about this. I shouldn't have to worry about this. And though that may be true, by looking at it that way, it can only cause more stress in our lives, not reduce that. So here's just a quick thing about what happens to the body and mind when we're exposed to consistent long-term stress like we are dealing with now, potentially. There can be cognitive challenges, and that, along with that, would go memory issues, decreased ability to concentrate. Your thoughts might not be as clear as they used to be. Sometimes you can lose perspective or objectivity, and sometimes I'll call that tunnel vision. You're only seeing the challenges that are in front of you, and you lose sight of the bigger picture. And along with that could come increased worry, racing thoughts sometimes, this focusing on the negative, and from time to time, maybe making poor judgments. And those can come in many different forms. Some of them are not going to be necessarily harmful in the long run, but you just wonder why you chose one option instead of another. And it could be the fact that you're dealing with a lot of stress and it's impacting you cognitively. And so that's cognitive. Emotionally, of course, we could be impacted by being moody, feeling agitated, having a sense of restlessness. I know I've felt a lot of that as of late, like maybe I should be out doing something else. What else should I be doing, even though I've been very busy doing what I am doing? A lot of people then will displace those emotional feelings into anger and maybe turn it on someone or something, feeling a little impatient, loneliness and isolation. You know, isolation is a real trigger for us as human beings to feel a sense of worry. And also relationship issues can be a challenge. So behaviorally, we talked about some of them. Sleep disruption is one. Eating patterns might be disrupted. Increasing substances. Neglecting responsibilities is a possibility. And then physically, and sometimes they'll call this somatic issues. Somatic means the physical representation of stress in the body. And they could be any of these things: headaches, backaches, muscle pain, tension, chest pain, rapid heartbeat, feeling butterflies. It could be diarrhea, constipation, I was talking to one of my clients yesterday, and she says she doesn't feel that good about herself because she's been basically in the house for 2.5 months now and feels like she gained some weight. And that alone is making her not feel good about herself. So all of those things could be a potential physical situation. Okay, I'm going to move on in the interest of time. During a stressful situation like this, we hear this a lot, maybe sometimes too much, but I'm just going to spend a little time on this whole idea of communication and how important that is. And during a stressful situation like we're dealing with now, the idea of good communication can be one of the most important tools that we can have for maintaining healthy relationships. So that could be some of these communication issues can be brought on from being isolated most of the time, or the opposite, like being around people 24/7, maybe our significant others or our kids. And then that alone brings about its own challenges, right? Needing your own space sometimes. And if we're able to communicate, we can then accurately let people know what we're thinking and feeling so that it doesn't come out in other ways And we'll talk about some of those ways. If we are constantly having conversations about negative things or predictions of negative things, that's going to be a very, a challenge for us, obviously, in terms of our family. So it's about balancing difficult information with more uplifting news in your discussion. And when I say that, I certainly don't mean pie in the sky. I mean that there's going to be difficult information that we might have to convey to our families, but there can also be corresponding reasons for hope or promise. So because of the difficult things, don't lose sight of the other, that there can also be uplifting and positive things. Try to remember to be respectful and calm, even if people are getting on our nerves, if our kids are getting on our nerves. Remember to stop and be respectful. If you find yourself in the middle of a conflict and your ability to resolve it isn't working, sometimes it's a good idea to take a break. Set a time to revisit the issue. You might say, we're not coming to a positive conclusion right now, but I do want to talk about this with you at a later time. So let's set another time to talk about that. So you're keeping that line of communication open. Okay. Also, when we get under a lot of stress, try to be alert to your tone of your voice, because how we say something is more important than what you say. You've probably heard that before, but nonverbal communication is actually 60% of the message. So it's not the words, but it is the tone in which we say them. If possible, try to avoid words like always, like saying you always do something or you never do something. And think about this for yourself. If you've heard your significant other tell you that, you always say that or you never do that, that leaves us really one place to go, and that's to be defensive. So that's a sure way to bring out defensiveness. So the other thing is, try to avoid, I know a lot of us use sarcasm, but when possible, try to drop the sarcasm, and especially with kids. We always advise that you don't use sarcasm around kids. Sometimes sarcasm has been referred to as smiling anger. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but it's almost like you're trying to be funny about something, but you're really angry about it. And to always use sarcasm means to really not be honest with your feelings. And it almost sounds contemptuous in a way to people when we're not being open and honest. So I would say that if we use a lot of sarcasm, that's not going to go away in a day. But just try to be aware of how much sarcasm you're using. This whole idea of silence can be golden. Sometimes silence is an appropriate response. And that's not the silent treatment. Because I don't know how you all feel about that, but I know personally, I'd rather be yelled at than have the silent treatment. That's a tough one to deal with. But instead of saying something that you know is going to be caustic or negative, sometimes holding back too is a good idea. Okay, another thing. So here are some things that we can do about stress in our lives. And one is the whole idea of being able to be in control of our breathing. And you hear that a lot. And a lot of people are kind of resistant to the whole idea of breathing. Like I've heard people say, you know what, I've been breathing since I was born, right? I can breathe. But the whole idea of breathing for relaxation is that you can gain control of your breathing. And they know, like they've done studies, that if you are able, if you become under a lot of stress, you're feeling anxiety, or even when I work with people who are experiencing panic attacks, we teach them to try to get control of your breathing. Because when you are under a lot of stress, your breathing becomes more shallow. So you start taking series of breaths through your mouth, and a lot of short series of breaths like that. And we don't even realize we're doing it. It's just something that we do automatically. And that triggers that emergency response in our body. And so we start releasing adrenaline, and we start to feel this sense of hyperarousal. And if you can then consciously override that feeling with some deep, slow breaths, then you're able to, basically, in layman's terms, what you're doing is you're sending this message to your central nervous system that says, we got this, okay? We can handle this. So you want to then just take some slow, deep breaths in through your nose, hold it for a second or two, and then release it through your mouth. And if you have trouble breathing through your nose, that's okay. You can breathe in through your mouth. But if possible, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And so that's a sure way to actually help your body start to release a lot of anxiety. The other thing that happens when you're taking those slow, shallow breaths is that carbon dioxide builds up in your bloodstream because you're not releasing the old oxygen from your lungs. And so that carbon dioxide doesn't bring enough oxygen to the brain. And that's when we start to get distorted thinking and excessive worry about things. And by breathing deeply and slowly, you could have more oxygen flowing to the brain, which then helps you make better decisions. I wanted to just describe a technique to you real quickly. And I want to describe this technique because it's so effective, and especially with kids. If you have children, you can teach them this technique. It's used in schools. They teach whole classrooms of kids to use this technique. And I've just called it a hand trace in this situation, but sometimes it's called starfish breathing. And here's how it works. And it just takes a minute to practice this. What you want to do is take your left hand and just hold it out and stretch out your hand, and so you're facing your palm. Then you take your right hand and take your pointer finger and you just put it at the base of your thumb on your hand. And what you're going to do is you're going to trace up to the top of your thumb with your finger. And as you do that, you're going to breathe in through your nose and hold it. So breathe in, trace up, and then trace down the other side of your thumb and breathe out. And then you're going to trace up your pointer finger and breathe in. And then trace down your pointer finger and breathe out. And then trace up your index finger and breathe in. And down your index finger and breathe out. And just do that the whole way through your hand. And your pinky finger up and to the bottom and breathe out. Try this and practice it and see how you feel, because this helps. I know it helps adults a lot, but it also really helps kids because it's a grounding mechanism, because you have the tactile sense of touch and you have to concentrate on this for a minute. So your thoughts are going away from other worries, and then you're combining it with slow and intentional breathing. So even though it seems like a very simple thing, it can really go a long way to help people calm down. And sometimes I know there's adults that'll do this at their desk if they get some stressful situation that they're dealing with. And so you might want to practice that. So it's called a hand trace or starfish breathing. Okay. So I have a couple slides that really are just focused on things that you can do to de-stress. But you know, every one of us is different. We all, like, what might be very relaxing for somebody else isn't going to be for somebody else. Like somebody might say, oh, I like to go for a 5-mile run. That relaxes me. But not everyone's going to step out their door and go run 5 miles. That probably wouldn't even be a good idea for some people. So these are just some ideas potentially. And some of them might resonate with you, and some of them might be they might not work for you. But if you could pick one or two things from this list, it can potentially be helpful. So some people use a prayer or meditation a lot of times, and I use that, and I find that very relaxing. Some people like to do like a massage, a face massage, head or shoulders. Other people go for massages. They say that's fantastic. Maybe it could be as simple as calling or texting someone that makes you feel good, or someone who makes you laugh. It could be taking a hot shower or a bath. Maybe listening to music. I'm a big fan of music myself, so I've been doing a lot of that. Maybe getting more in touch with music maybe I haven't listened to for a long time. Maybe it's listening to a comedian that you like, reading a magazine or a book. Maybe concentrating on a pleasant memory. I've been finding myself doing that a lot lately. And some people are real handy around the house and they want to repair or tinker with things around the house. But, be careful about that. I was talking with somebody a couple of days ago, and they were feeling really badly because they said they've been home a lot more because they haven't been allowed to go into work. But then they keep thinking, oh, I have all of these closets I should be rearranging, but I'm not doing it. And they kept dwelling on that. So rather than enjoying the time that they had to relax in their house, they're thinking that they should be doing something else. So it's, I guess, being aware of that. It's going to be different for people. Like maybe somebody will find it relaxing to go in and actually rearrange that closet. But if it's not going to be relaxing, find something that is. So mailing someone a card or letter, that's kind of a lost art as of lately. Maybe making a list of things that you want to do in when things become a little bit freer for us. Maybe being able to make someone laugh around you. Doing something nice for somebody, random acts of kindness, that always goes a long way. That's something I enjoy to do, just unexpectedly doing something nice for somebody. So there's other things, like we could go on, but think about what those things are for you that you like to do. And make sure that you set aside some time to engage in those types of activities. This whole idea of sleep has become such an important thing that, they'll call it sleep hygiene now, because it's such an important factor in our health and wellness. But it's also one of the more difficult things, I think, to change, especially when we get into patterns that we get into. But if on a healthy sleep schedule, they were saying it could be really important to go to bed at the same time each night and get up at the same time each morning. I'm not sure how many of us have that luxury. Some of us have that luxury, but maybe others, when you're dealing with larger families or other obligations, you don't always have the time to go to bed, say at like 10 o'clock each night. Maybe you'd like to go to bed at 10 o'clock, but you find that you can't go to bed till midnight. So that becomes a challenge. But the closer to being consistent about that we can be, the better off we're going to be in terms of that. And of course, our computers, our iPhones, all of those things, the screen time, that actually sets in motion metabolic changes in our bodies. So to avoid using those electronic instruments at least a half hour before we try to go to sleep. Again, it may be doable for you, it may not, but the best advice is to stop using those things if you can. Maybe there is, and maybe some of you have developed these already, but a soothing routine that you have before you go to bed each night. And I know some people, this slide might be coming up in a few slides, but there's this whole idea of a gratitude practice that people will do sometimes at night. And what they'll do before they go to sleep is they'll write down 3 things that happened that day that they feel grateful for. And that can really change your whole kind of outlook, especially if you've had a stressful day, a lot of worries. That can tend to affect your sleep in different ways, prevent us from going into REM sleep. But we can change that focus just a little bit by being mindful and being actually very intentional. That's the word I was looking for. Being intentional about changing our outlook. So being intentional might be knowing that even if a lot of stressful things happen, there were probably a few good things that happened too. And it would behoove us to get in touch with what those things are. And then also paying attention to what we eat and drink before bedtime, avoid drinking alcohol, caffeine, obviously, and not eating heavy meals close to bedtime. Those are all good things. I mean, when you think about this, sometimes I think about it this way. A lot of times it's like good advice that we just can't take. But if we can remind ourselves of these things once in a while, not 24/7, but that we can be mindful of these things, maybe we can start to gradually change them. Okay. So we're going to move on to this slide. This idea is about, we only have a couple of slides left. This slide really is about taking new perspectives in how we approach stressful things in our lives. And we know this to be true, that each stressful event that we have to face in our lives, our thoughts are the first things that we have about that event. And then our thoughts bring about an emotional reaction. So if we have really negative, pessimistic thoughts about stressful situations, we rarely have positive thoughts about stressful situations. But if we have a lot of negative, pessimistic thoughts, our feelings then are going to follow, and they're going to be potentially more negative than they have to be. So one of the ideas behind this is that we take a look at what these thoughts are. So we start to just slow things down. Again, be intentional. When we have a stressful situation, be aware of what those thoughts are. This can be useful, like if you are trying to meditate or be prayerful. When you're in those times and you're trying to slow things down, those are times when really our thoughts try to hijack us. And instead of saying, I can't think about what those thoughts are right now, acknowledge what those thoughts are and be aware of them. But then just say, I'm aware I'm having those thoughts right now, but I'm going to let them go because I'm looking to do something different right now. But also then in looking at in becoming aware of what those thoughts are, we can start to change them around a little bit so that they're a little bit more positive. Again, not being pie in the sky, but rather than thinking about them as being catastrophic, we can think about them in a way that's a little bit less upsetting. It can still be potentially upsetting, but it doesn't have to be catastrophic, right? We don't have to get into that fairy tale where the apple falls from the tree and they think the sky's now falling. And that becomes true for us. Like when one negative thing happens, we think that a whole succession of negative things are going to happen. So if we get in touch with that, we can turn it around a little. And so consider how you could respond to whatever negative thoughts that you're having about the COVID-19 situation or just the transition situation, because now that things are starting to change, that we're being able to have more freedom, that's also not going to automatically end our worries, but it's going to bring different challenges for us. So how can we respond to maybe negative thoughts we're having about maybe having to go back into the office, or the fact that maybe our children are going to be exposed to potential threats in different ways. And so being aware of what those thoughts are and making sure that those thoughts are more realistic. So even in stressful situations, like our current pandemic, there are going to be co-occurring positives. In fact, we're starting to see that a lot now. How many people around us have kind of risen to the challenge, how many people have decided that they're going to help people in different ways, because challenges in front of us, though they bring out the worst enough in us sometimes, they also have the potential to bring out the best in us. And so that is always out there too, and something to be aware of. Like, how can we tap into those things around us? And who are the people trying to support us too? Because I think it's important to get in touch with what support systems that we have available to us in times like these. We have our very famous resident of Pittsburgh, Mr. Rogers, and his famous quote that he said to children and to all of us: when times get really tough, and they will sometimes, look for the helpers, because there's always going to be helpers. And potentially, we can be one of those helpers in some way, in some form or fashion. So remember that we can turn off the TV. It's very healthy to go outside now, especially now that the weather's getting warmer and it's getting nicer outside. And we can spend time with our loved ones in a socially appropriate way. And we can start to notice a shift in how we start to feel about things. And take time to enjoy the outdoors, and take times to move our bodies by stretching or walking or biking or whatever activity fits your physical level. So along the lines of some of the things that we talked about, maybe you might want to try that activity this evening or sometime soon, that you want to consider 3 positive things that you have experienced today, and maybe 1 thing that you're looking forward to tomorrow. And you can either, some of us like to write things down, and so you can put those in a journal, or you could write it down on a Post-it note on your bedstand, or you can just put it in your head. And either way, it's going to be helpful. So I know a lot of things and ideas that we talked about. And I think with perseverance and with experience, because we're all going through this together, we're learning things about ourselves in this process. Maybe some things that we feel good about, maybe some things that we'd like to change. At any rate, we're not going to be the same. An experience like this is going to change us. We can regain our equilibrium, right? But we're going to be changed in some fashion. So I think that a lot of those changes are going to result in personal growth and a feeling that we have overcome this, we've survived it, and we can bring that strength that we now have into other situations. So I hopefully that has been helpful for all of you, and I'll leave you with this quote by Byrne William that just says, "Man has never made any material as resilient as the human spirit." And so the human spirit is resilient, and we have that ability to tap into that better part of ourselves. So thank you for being so observant and interested in this subject tonight. I appreciate it.